pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater, but today we're going to do something a little different. Welcome to a special episode of a pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater that is going to kind of break our cyclical cycle a little bit. Every now and again, Pastor Michele and I would like to do some episodes on certain events and holidays and in this case tragedies that arise or have arisen in the past, and reflect on them theologically through movies that have been made about them. So in this case, we're going to be discussing September 11th, 2001 in film, as we approach the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001. By the time this is published, it'll probably be a few days after September 11th, 2021. As of right now, it's September the 4th. But we feel it important to reflect on that event, and it's interesting. We made this plan before the fall of Kabul, Afghanistan, which occurred on, I want to say, August the 15th. But it I'm going to look that up. But it certainly the fact that we have lost the war in Afghanistan now, that the United States has lost the war in Afghanistan, will most definitely add to our reflection on these films and on our experience of September 11th itself. So, Pastor Michele, I'm curious, where were you on September 11th, 2001?
So I would have been 13 at the time, and I remember going into, I think my first class of the day was science, 8th grade science. And I really didn't know a whole lot about what was going on, other than maybe that one of the towers had been hit, and then a little bit later on finding out about the Pentagon. But I was, the long and short was, I was in middle school. I was living in Dallas, Fort Worth area at the time, in Lewisville, Texas, and we happened to be pretty much right under the flight path for a lot of the planes that were going out of there. And so one of the things that I think about in the aftermath of that was when all the planes were grounded for a few weeks there, and it was just so quiet compared to what we were used to of hearing planes go overhead. And then my folks tell the story of hearing when the first plane went out again, and it was like 3 a.m. or something, and they heard it leave, and they say that they both sat up and kind of looked at each other, and they knew that a plane was going over again, and not as an anxiety, but just as a noticing of what was going on. So that's, I mean, I'm sure I could say more along the way, but that's kind of the general gist of where I was when I found out.
My first hour was debate. I was a sophomore in high school, and I was on the debate team. We were the topic for discussion and policy debate that year was, oddly enough, weapons of mass destruction. And so it definitely had an impact on our debate year. But laying that aside, I remember that it was just a normal day. We spent all of our days in debate doing research, basically, for preparing for the next tournament. And of course, we hadn't had a tournament yet. And then all of a sudden, a classmate of mine who had been researching in the library, which is just across the hall, came in, and her name was Ola Shaheen. She was a Muslim woman and from Egypt. And she said that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. Mm-hmm. And so we immediately turned on the television, and we were glued to the television. By that time, the second plane had hit. So it was obvious to anyone who was in the know that this was terrorism, an attack. Of course, I didn't know. I thought it still might have been an accident. Who knew? I remember one of my classmates said, "It really sucks to be an Arab in this country right now."
Wow.
He was an African-American fellow who said that.
Wow.
And it made me feel angry because it I at the time saw myself as very patriotic, and so it sort of, my initial reaction was one of nationalism, and so yeah, I spent the day reflecting sort of on it from a nationalistic perspective. And almost all of our classes, like with the exception of our math class and our science class, we did a lab in science. But with the exception of those two classes, all we did was watch the news all day.
Well, and what was interesting at my brother's high school, they would not let them have the news on that day. And for the most part, we maybe talked about it a little bit in my classes, but because my second period English composition teacher, she had a daughter who was in New York at the time, and of course was waiting to hear about what was going on and make sure she was okay. She was, thank God. But then in my history class, we talked a little bit about it, and we watched some of the news, and I remember this sense of knowing that things had changed in the country, but not really understanding the full scope of how much that would impact the country for the years to come.
Yeah, it was dialectical in my head between, on the one hand, seeing, like, just experiencing the day as a normal day. I'm in school, we're studying, of course, only two of our classes actually did any studying, but I'm in school, we're studying, went to lunch, I, did the things I normally do. And then on the other hand, realizing that, this is something different. And of course, having that nationalistic, jingoistic, passionate response to it. And yet it's interesting. I remember I was going to stay after school to do some research for debate. So I did, and my mother came and got me. And she reminded me, so I you might know, listener, we've discussed it, that I have a fear of nuclear war, which I had at the time. And when I would go off to scout camp as a child, right, I would make my parents promise that if there was any situation in the world that could turn into a nuclear war, that they would come and get me. Silly things a kid would do. But my mother came and got me. I was doing research for debate. My mother came and got me, and I said, "Well, what are you doing, Mom?" "I'm just doing research." I mean, and she reminded me of that promise. She said that, "No, you once told me that if ever there was any situation in the world that looked like it could be really seriously dangerous, that I would come and get you." And so here I am. And so she came and took me home. And I remember trying to do homework, but my father calling me down from my homework to watch the news, because this was history, and it's more important than homework, is what he said, and he was right. But yeah, so there's sort of an odd dialectic between, on the one hand, it was such a normal day because, well, we were 1,000 miles away, didn't really affect us that much, and we were quite safe the whole day. And on the other hand, watching this whole thing unfold on television, and that's the reason why I kind of wanted to do this a little different. Whereas, for the day after, which was also about a hypothetical traumatic event, we still kept the comedic opening, right? Because, well, there hasn't been World War III yet, there hasn't been a nuclear war yet, but September 11th, something that actually happened, and that we watched on television, and that although it was nowhere near as traumatic as actually having been there, it did have an impact even on those of us who watched it on television.
Well, and it's interesting. Would you say that, I mean, I'm just thinking about where technology was at that point. And I would say maybe that was kind of the first time where things like the 24-hour cable news was starting to develop, internet was starting to develop some, and I wonder if that impacted how we as Americans processed what happened.
The World Wide Web was in its 10th year. It was just about to turn 10 years old because it began in 1991. Although the internet itself has in some form or another, actually been around since the 60s. It's just networking of computers, mostly for military purposes, but that's been around for a long time. That's where the internet comes from. But the World Wide Web, which is the internet as we understand it, began in 1991. The 24-hour news network cycle began. The 24-hour news cycle really began in the early 80s when CNN was started, and of course, it really the event that really made CNN was the Gulf War. That's when CNN really came of age. But the 24-hour news cycle, at least for cable news viewers, was about 20 years old, and the internet was about 10. Well, as we know it, is about 10 years old. But yeah, you're right. It did definitely impact how people reflected on the tragedy because, well, I mean, it's sort of a microcosm of what we see in today's politics, I think, with not only 24-hour news and the internet per se, but also social media, a constant stream of social media commentary that really changes the way in which we process events as they happen. People processing the attack on Pearl Harbor was far different than how people processed September 11th or the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And it's interesting, though. There was a great hope. Well, there was a thought that the internet would result in greater democracy, a greater sense of a shrinking world, a sense of greater solidarity between people. But it actually turns out that in some respect that the opposite has occurred in the age of social media, that the result is, I mean, you consider that the national response to Pearl Harbor was one of extreme national solidarity to the point of being unhealthy, that, you know, an extreme wave of patriotism that mobilized our nation to defeat Nazi Germany and defeat the Empire of Japan and fascist Italy. And yet now the result has been, I would say, far more mixed, for better or for worse. And now this instant use of electronics to communicate with each other has not resulted in greater solidarity. Sometimes, I suppose, but or to some extent, I suppose, but it's also resulted in, you know, these political arguments that go on ad nauseum, that all they do is cause pain. So.
Agreed. So, are we ready to jump into our movies?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, the three movies that we watched were United 93, World Trade Center, and Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close. And we will talk about the first two first and then move into Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close later on. It had been quite a while since I had seen World Trade Center, and I had not ever seen United 93. I did not expect them to be as difficult to watch as they ended up being for me. And I don't know if that's just because we're living in a time where my tension and grief is already kind of a little rawer than it would be under non-pandemic circumstances, or if it's just it brings up all of that old stuff that maybe I haven't really sat down and just said, you know, what did this do? But I'll just start by saying it hit me in ways that I didn't quite expect.
Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I'm trying to think of like specific moments where that happened other than just, I think there's something to the fact that you said earlier, it was a lot further away from us. It didn't affect us as much, and that's very true. And so for example, with World Trade Center, to kind of be there in the hole with them as they're trying to stay awake, as they're trying to survive and all of that, it's a lot harder when it's right in front of you in ways that it felt more distant watching it on a TV screen. And there was kind of a lot about the chaos of the day and the just trying to, okay, here, you're going to go here, you're going to go here. Oh my gosh, we're here. And the tower's coming down before we can get out, kind of thing. And it's a different thing to have to kind of sit in the midst of that versus just kind of watching what we saw on the news, what was reported that day.
It's interesting that I wonder if it's perhaps more traumatic than, say, watching the film Pearl Harbor, which is and I'll say this every time I mention that film, that it's a bad movie, but it's good at what it does. It's more traumatic to watch these films than it is to watch Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor is an abstraction for us, for our generation. It's history, right? We didn't see it happen. Whereas for, even though we saw it unfold on television, we still saw it happen. We still saw images of people falling out of the buildings.
Yeah.
And, we essentially, it was a traumatic experience for us, even though it wasn't nearly as traumatic as if we had been in New York. It nevertheless was a traumatic experience. And so it's much different watching a film like World Trade Center or United 93 than watching, say, Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Well, and then I think the thing about 93, United 93, that was so powerful for me was the way that they did the ending, where they basically had you in the cockpit as you were watching the plane crashing. And that was from a cinematography perspective, it was really, really powerful that was, you could really feel the sense of going down with it. And so I give one of the things that you said about Pearl Harbor is that it does kind of do its job of pulling out those emotions, and I would say that's true for all of these movies as well.
War is an abstraction for me, and I presume to say for yourself as well, although I shan't
Correct.
speak for you.
Correct.
Because we've never been in combat. We wouldn't know the first thing about what it's like.
And I've not had immediate family who has served to worry about them being somewhere. And
I have been in a skyscraper, and I have flown in an airplane. So watching the plane go down in the ground, that hits a little closer to home. In fact, I remember in 2005, I visited the Sears Tower and went up to the observation deck on the Sears Tower. And it was a wonderful experience, but I just kept thinking in my head, I just kept watching for the plane to come and hit the tower. I swear that's where my mind went. I could not get September 11th out of my head in 2000, 4 years later, as I was sitting in the Sears Tower.
Wow. And I think that goes back to this sense of trauma that we as a culture have, and our brains are designed to kind of absorb that stuff so that we can prepare for it, to learn from it. It's a survival mechanism that we're the Velcro for the negative, but it definitely sticks with us then. And I think that trauma, I haven't studied nearly enough about trauma. There's a list of books that I want to read about it. But more and more, it's an area of interest for me, because so much of these experiences is traumatic. I think that we all have some level of trauma from life experiences that we grow up with. And unless and until we can deal with that and heal it, not to dismiss it and say, let's gloss it over, but to say truly, I have lived this, now what?
What I would say about the films, the two films, is that there's not a lot of there, and I think that's intentional. That there's not a lot of meaning to be had, and I think that's similar in a sense to the movie Pearl Harbor. It's entirely emotional, right? The whole point of the film is to watch it happen and feel something, right? If I were to pick out a few scenes in which that were quite meaningful in World Trade Center, I would say the from a chaplain's perspective, what John McLaughlin's wife did for the woman in the hospital waiting room when they were speaking together, and and what the woman did for John McLaughlin's wife. And in fact, even in that scene, McLaughlin's wife says thank you to her as they're crying together, because it was sort of they gave each other permission to cry and to grieve and I think that was a powerful moment and a meaningful moment. At the end of the day, I think the film, you could say a tremendous amount about friendship and about camaraderie. The scene that always gets me choked up is when Nicolas Cage, and I've seen the movie a number of times, is when Nicolas Cage comes to the men who are the police officers who are gathered together waiting to go, and he says, "All right, we got to evacuate the tower. Who's coming? Step forward." Everybody's looking around, and all of a sudden, Jimeno says, "I got it, Sarge," and then Rodriguez, "I'll go," and then the other guy, whoever his name was, I should know his name. Yeah, I'll go too.
Yeah. Well, and I think World Trade Center particularly is powerful, that phrase, "you die, I die."
Yeah.
And they literally are trying to keep each other alive. That's why they're staying in conversation, so that they don't drift off and then not come back. And I think for me, there's something to be said about the resiliency of the human spirit, that I do think these moments of tragedy, and we said this in our conversation, it is so sad that it takes us these moments of tragedy to remind us of how resilient we are. And then there's times where I get the expression, "Darn it, I wish I didn't have to be so resilient."
Yeah. I think that it's particularly powerful that both United 93 and World Trade Center, about those whom St. Fred would call, St. Fred Rogers, I think he's a saint, sue me, would call the helpers, right? Look for the helpers, says St. Fred Rogers. And this is about the helpers, the Port Authority police officers and the firefighters who are going in to try to rescue people on essentially what is a suicide mission. And then I think that's true of the passengers who tried to take the plane back as well. They figured that, all right, so we're going to die anyways. We're not going to take anyone with us. Maybe we've got a shot of retaking the plane and getting this pilot and air traffic controller to talk us down, as it turns out. But yeah, and to me, the empowerment that I feel when thinking on that story, and I keep coming back to Pearl Harbor, and there's a reason for that, and we can go into that, but not only because September 11th from a historical perspective is very similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, I think, but also because September 11th occurred at a time in which I loved the movie Pearl Harbor, and in which that movie, although it's a terrible film, did play a role in my emotional development and in my discovering of my love of films. And what I found particularly empowering about the movie Pearl Harbor and about two movies, United 93 and World Trade Center, was that its depiction of the helpers, that we tell our children, yes, there are monsters, but the monsters can be beaten. And then, we can, the resiliency of the human spirit is not just that we can survive, but that we can thrive and we can rise up and destroy evil. Of course, then to me, what was so traumatic about the fall of Kabul is that the war that resulted from September 11th, the war that lended itself to the mythology of us coming together to rise up as one, to gain the inevitable triumph by our righteous might, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt would say, we lost it. And so this myth of redemptive violence is killed. The myth part of being the helper is exercising righteous violence is killed right in front of us, and there's nothing left to it.
Yeah, it's kind of a, what was it all for?
Yeah. And without it, that's sort of why I feel why I really appreciate it Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close as a movie, because at the end of the day, we're left with nothing but real meaningless pain that we somehow have to make meaning of.
And back to the World Trade Center too, I like some of the very, very ending is that September 11th brought out the worst of humanity, but it also brought out the best. And I'm not remembering everything that was said, but essentially it comes down to, yes, we can look at this as a horrible, terrible experience, and it was. But as you say, we can look for the helpers. We can look for the ways that we saw humanity respond. I'm not entirely convinced that it did bring out the best in humanity at times.
No.
Because I still think that we definitely reacted out of a place of fear in the time that came. And I'm with you when you talked about having the kind of nationalist, jingoist kind of response post 9/11. I think I felt that too, and I think a lot of people were in that mode, and it's just what was in the moment, but in the reflection back afterwards, the more I can kind of say, maybe we could have made some different choices along the way.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the good news is that now the Marxist in me is going to say that policing is always political, and even firefighting is political. There's nothing that isn't political, and that's a piece of feminist doctrine too. Nevertheless, the act of running into a burning building, whether or not it's done by someone who serves in a capitalist police force, is still a heroic act, and it's something to be celebrated. And the fact that, I mean, consider this: 2,000 some odd people lost their lives in, I think 2,700 people lost their lives at the World Trade Center itself on a day when there would be 50,000 people there. So what that means is the firefighters, Port Authority police officers, New York City police officers, and other first responders who showed up and did their jobs succeeded. And if you're looking for a victory, that's it. They won. They got out just about everybody they could. Most of the people who died were above the impact points in the two towers. In the North Tower, the plane cut all of the stairwells. So if you were above, I want to say the 78th floor, you could not survive. Nobody above the impact point survived in the North Tower. In the South Tower, the plane hit the building in an angle, leaving one of the stairwells intact, and I think maybe less than 20 people made it down. But the point is, and of course, it's also interesting that there's a line in World Trade Center, one of the firefighters that said it just took us an hour to get up to floor 30 in the North Tower. Now they want us in the South Tower. That's another thing. Carrying all that equipment, it would have taken them hours, literally hours, to get up to the 100th floors. In fact, there's a story of a marathon runner, a firefighter marathon runner, who actually ran ahead of his unit and made it up to, I want to say, the 65th floor when the North Tower collapsed, or not the North Tower, the South Tower collapsed, and he was radioing his position and that sort of thing. And they were calculating the amount of calories he was burning and the amount of stress he was putting under his body to climb those stairs in full firefighter equipment. And it was truly immense. And yet they managed to evacuate. They managed to evacuate everyone they could. That's a victory. So
yeah, I mean, it is powerful to hear those stories of the heroes, the helpers. And then what I also find really fascinating sometimes is this thought that we don't hear about the near misses, the attacks that get avoided. We, I mean, and more of what could have happened that day. We really don't. We don't often hear about those things. And so I think about all of the people who, people like the air traffic control who had to figure out how they were going to respond, who had to get all the other planes landed safely, just all of these other behind the scenes moving pieces. When, it's easy to say, was that day a success or a failure? And it's a really interesting question to define. Did terror ultimately win? And I would argue that it didn't, because we kept going. We didn't let fear stop us completely.
Every life lost was a failure. Every life saved was a success.
Yeah. And that's fair too. I don't mean to, it's not that I want to diminish the lives that were lost at all.
And I think that politically, there's no way we could say that the response to the September 11th attacks was anything but a failure. But I think you're right, though. I mean, you see that common decency and goodness, maybe not heroism so much as putting one's life on the line because it's the right thing to do, saved 47,000 lives.
Yeah.
And that's a victory. And I think, our politics has torn itself apart consistently out of fear since September 11th. I think that's what the Trump phenomenon is. But I also think that, well, okay, so our politics is tearing itself apart. People are still good.
I wanted to bring that up actually, this sense of where we are right now politically and how divided we are, and drawing, it seems like there's such a contrast between that moment where things were seemingly so united and everyone, you had all of the senators singing God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol that night, and now we have this place where they don't even talk to each other in Congress, and it's like I almost wonder sometimes if that was the beginning of the end,
Yeah,
or if it was was it a breath point before of something that was already going on, or I will be interested to see what history will bear out on that.
yeah, me too. I agree, and I suppose my intuition tells me that jingoism is a farce, that nationalism is a farce. I think there's
Mhm.
something to be said for what we might call civic patriotism,
Mhm.
the idea of understanding that we belong to a community and seeking the best for the community. That to me is patriotism, and that to me is laudable. But I think that we put our trust in nationalism, which is itself a kind of systematic fear. What we have learned is that we put our trust in the wrong thing, and it didn't bring us together. It divided us, drove us further apart.
Mhm.
It didn't lead us to victory against the Taliban, or I mean, I think Al Qaeda is pretty well devastated, but it didn't lead us to ultimate victory against the Taliban. It led us to defeat. Maybe there was another option. Maybe we could have put our trust in something a little bit more, perhaps naive, common decency, something like
Mhm.
that. But instead we chose a sense of nationalism and a sense of pride, and it didn't work. And I think that what that does is it shows us it's a good lesson, a painfully wrought lesson, but a good lesson, that the wages of nationalism is death.
So I want to shift gears just ever so slightly and give me a second to remember exactly what I was going to say with this. Oh, okay. So at the end of Pearl Harbor, one of the Japanese generals says, "I fear all we've done is woken a sleeping giant." Would you say that for me, when I think about September 11th, for me, a loss of innocence of the country, and how we had kind of been lulled into a sense of security and complacency, and this kind of woke us up out of that.
I think it put us back to sleep.
Hmm. Say more.
Um, well, when Admiral Yamamoto said, "I fear that all we've done is to awaken a sleeping giant," what the attack on Pearl Harbor was probably the worst thing that could have happened to the Axis powers,
Mm-hmm.
because the British were pretty well all but conquered. They managed to stave off invasion, but only just, and rather heroically so, I might add. The Soviet Union was would have been difficult for the Nazis to really conquer, but at the end of the day, the Soviet leadership was extremely incompetent, and so their equipment was far worse than the Germans. So it's very likely that without pulling American production into the war, that things would have turned out a lot differently. I fear that we've awakened a sleeping giant, meaning I fear that we've basically killed ourselves, that we've awakened an enemy that we can't beat. And Yamamoto himself, as a historical figure, was quite intelligent in that regard, because he studied in the United States. He studied at either Harvard or Yale, actually. And so he was very intimately aware of American culture and of American industry. And he urged against attacking Pearl Harbor. Although he planned it, he was commander general to plan it, but he urged against war with the United States. And his statement was that you go to war against the United States, you will lose, because you can't beat them. Now I think we didn't awaken a sleeping giant. We put a giant to bed. I mean, September 11th didn't make us better politically. It didn't. We didn't. I mean, if you listen to Roosevelt's speech, with confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounded determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the United States of America, in our righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. Didn't happen. Not this time. And it's a different situation. It's more complicated. It's not great power war anymore. It's insurgency and terror, and it just didn't work that way. The same kind of nationalism that we brought to bear in World War II, for better and worse, didn't work in the war on terror.
No. Well, I mean, and that's just it. Part of the biggest issue of this whole thing is that we declared war on an enemy that doesn't have a nation, that doesn't have a specific, I mean, it's like trying to fight the Hydra, where there's all these heads and you can take any one off, but you can never really defeat it. And so that's always been kind of the challenge. And I know we're kind of getting off into the political side of things here, but
it's a political event.
Yeah. It's really hard. It comes down to what causes terror. And we have done very little, and in fact, we've worsened addressing the causes of terror in the world. Because we have not helped global poverty. We have not helped create situations where disaffected people can be recruited and radicalized. We have not dealt with these ideological things. And I'm probably not as articulate and specific on that one as I could be, but I just think, again, it's like, okay, what causes people to be involved in terrorism?
Be afraid.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting that the word terrorism is itself a very, very theologically pregnant word. To think about it. Something Gandhi said, that we think hatred is the real enemy. It's not, it's fear. And I butchered that quote, but something like that.
There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear.
Yeah. And terrorism is the systematic practice of producing in the mind of your enemy a crippling fear. And that's exactly what happened to the United States after September 11th. Now, one could argue, I think, that the United States' imperial prowess was already sort of on the steady decline. To what extent September 11th took the floor out is debatable, but it certainly crippled us in a way that we could not consider reacting to September 11th in a way that exuded what I would call Christian righteousness. On the other hand, I don't really know what that would look like. What would Jesus do if Jesus were attacked on September 11th? But it was our fear. Terrorism is imposing fear that paralyzes. And it succeeded in the sense that it imposed a fear that paralyzed, at least in a political sense. And the other thing is that I wonder if what causes terrorism, now I'm not a political theorist and I don't play one on TV. I suppose I'll play one on this podcast, but I'm a theologian, but I wonder from a theological perspective, what causes fear is fear. What causes terrorism is terrorism. There's Siddhartha Gautama talks about the two arrows, right? There's the first arrow, which is the initial fear, which can be a gift, right? There's even a book called The Gift of Fear, how fear trains the mind to be aware of its surroundings, right?
Right.
And then there's fear turned in on itself, the second arrow, when pain becomes suffering, right? And then it builds on itself over and over, and it becomes a passion, and it becomes terror and anxiety.
So I just had a thought. Well, it may be not a very good one, but we'll try it out. I wonder if those who perpetrate acts of terrorism at their very core have some fear themselves.
Absolutely.
I think they're acting out of a place of fear as well.
I think all war is driven by fear, both the fear that you impose upon the enemy, what Bush would call shock and awe in the invasion of Iraq, which is terrorism, as well as the terror that drives people to kill other human beings. I don't see any way other than fear to drive people to take human life. anger, I suppose, but anger driven by a fear of losing something. And
Yeah.
but yes,
Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering.
thank you, Yoda. No, no, but it's interesting though. The war on terror is a misnomer. What is terrorism but war itself? All war is terrorism. What we're calling terrorism, I take it, as sort of a war prosecuted by non-state actors, maybe that's terrorism. I don't know. But shock and awe, there's fear in that language. We will impose shock and awe on the Hussein regime. We will terrorize them to submission.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not interested in going to war against a tactic of war. I mean, that makes no sense. It's like you're using terrorism to destroy terrorism. All it does is reproduce itself. I mean, if we're going to go to war, let's define our terms more carefully than that. We're going to war against an ideology that seeks to destroy or damage the United States and the Western world because reasons. I know there are specific reasons, but
so and I wanted to get into that too. One of the things that I thought United 93 did a really good job of in the beginning is it shows both the passengers and it shows the hijackers involved in acts of prayer.
Yes.
And so that really gets into an interesting philosophical question about prayer and what God hears, and it's a whole other thing, but it was just really interesting to me to see that juxtaposition, that everyone is praying, and yes, dear listener, they are praying to the same God.
Does God take sides?
Right. And how did God react that day? Where was God in the midst of that day? I mean, that's our act of theological reflection, right? Where is God in this?
All right. So what does the incarnation and the cross, what does the theology of the cross tell us? Pulling my Lutheranism here. I'm not a Lutheran, but I find a lot of Lutheranism to be very helpful. The theology of the cross would say that God was with those who are praying on both sides. And I'm not saying that both sides were justified, but God certainly hears the prayers of even those who are evil. Jesus says, God makes the sun to shine on the righteous and the wicked. And God was in the rubble with those who were suffering, and in the airplanes with those who were terrified. That's where God was, in the midst of the greatest suffering.
And maybe God was there whispering in the ear of the hijacker saying, don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. You're better than this.
Maybe. I think God does take sides. I think God is always for righteousness and always for the poor, oppressed, marginalized, and vulnerable and working classes. On the other hand, it's complicated when one brings to bear the sum total of actions that different political actors engage in. The United States, the Taliban, Soviet Union, you name it. A lot of them are good and a lot of them are evil. God is for the evil, or God is for the good and against the evil. And that looks very complicated to us because in our human minds, we want God to be on our side. Well, in some ways, God is on our side. But in other ways, God isn't on our side.
Yeah.
And that's very uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think about, maybe this is taking us in a slightly different direction, but I would say, maybe in the late 80s, early 90s, the Western world was becoming more aware of Islam as a faith, but it was still something that was pretty new. Let me put it this way: the average Jane and Joe on the street probably couldn't have told you that there were 5 pillars of Islam, and to have a sense of what they might be. And so my point in saying all of this is, I wonder, to what extent did some people learn more about Islam as a result of all of this? To what extent or less, I mean, I think that's the other thing, just as a processing how different reactions came out of this, because I think there are still times where you hear about a Muslim person praying before getting on a flight and getting pulled off because someone's uncomfortable.
Do you know that until 2001, Muslims were a solid Republican constituency?
I did not know that. Somehow, actually, that makes sense to me.
Muslims in the United States were a solid Republican contingency.
And I'm going to stop myself right here before we go further and say I want to be careful not to say Muslims as a whole group either. I want to be careful about that.
Sure, but most Greeks vote Democrat, most Jewish persons vote Democrat. I mean, these are statistics. I mean, it's not saying that all Jewish people.
Yeah, and so it doesn't surprise me actually, because there was definitely. So I will confess I went back and watched again Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, which has a lot of other points with it too, and take him with a grain of salt as a filmmaker and his perspectives, but he talks a lot about the financial connections between the Bush dynasty and the Sauds and the Bin Ladens, even to some, not as directly, but there's just definitely these connections there.
The way we understand the Muslim world is very different than the way, and I don't think it's fair to say that Islam is something new in the American political psyche. I think we've been aware of it for a long time. But the way we understood the Muslim world was very different 50 years ago than it is today. So the Middle East, until the Iranian Revolution, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, was a very secular area, dominated primarily by Arab nationalism and Arab socialism, politically speaking. Political trends called Nasserism and Baathism. Saddam Hussein was a Baathist. What's his name? Assad in Syria is a Baathist. Extreme Arab nationalism mixed in with some oddly left-wing socialism. Muammar Gaddafi was a Nasserist and Arab nationalist. So Islamism, political Islam, did not gain traction in the Muslim world really until 1979, with the exception of the Salafists in Saudi Arabia. Until the end of the 20th century, Muslims in this country were primarily Republican voting, primarily very conservative, primarily very wealthy. The way we changed our opinions, we tended to equate Islam with terror and with anger and with brutality. That's very new in our discord. But our awareness of Islam as a people is very old. It's just we used to see it in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. I stand corrected.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're just fine. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we talk about how this event shaped our understanding of Islam and of people of Arabic descent and of Islamic descent, and to understand there's a lot more nuances there than I think sometimes we realize.
Yeah, I wanted to invite someone onto the program to choose a movie. He decided he couldn't do it, but this fellow I was in debate with, after September 11th, he converted to Islam. He's a white man, European descent, and immediately after September 11th, he did what we all thought was a rather radical thing for a high school student to do, and he converted to Islam. And to this day, he remains a faithful Muslim, and has a beautiful family, and they live up in Boston. It was a blessing to get to know him, because even though he was a convert to Islam, because it was a blessing to have a human face to what was an abstraction to me. The religion of Islam was an abstraction. To some extent still is an abstraction, but when it's sort of the same effect that has occurred in recent decades as people who have been virulently anti-LGBTQIA have come into contact with people they know who are LGBTQIA, and all of a sudden their mind changes.
Right.
That contact with people changes. Now it's interesting. I was expecting us actually to spend more time on extremely loud, and incredibly close than we did on the first two films. Because, and of course, I think we spent more time speaking about September 11th as a phenomenon, because I think that's what those two films are about. They're about September 11th as a phenomenon. They're not really any. There's not a lot there. It's just the experience, the emotional experience of September 11th as a phenomenon.
So now let's get into Extremely Loud, Incredibly Close. And that's where we can talk about how the movie kind of speaks to the impact. Before we do, though, I thought a couple of other notes that I had from World Trade Center. I thought it was really fascinating that in the delirium hallucinations,
They see Jesus.
He sees Jesus, and it's what I found interesting was it had some very distinctive elements to it, like it had the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and then to me the most mundane element of giving a bottle of water. I mean, it seems so simplistic, and yet they talk about this language of they're in hell and it's on fire, and yet here Jesus is giving water.
Of course, Jesus is in hell. Where else would he be?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting that they find Jesus together as they share a kind of communion and suffering.
And then Nicolas Cage's character also kind of, well, I think they both see their families as well, but particularly I remember Nicolas Cage seeing his family.
There were two instances that struck me. There's the one of the buildings is collapsing, not one of the towers, but one of the other buildings is collapsing. Maybe number 5 World or number 7 World Trade Center, the Marriott Hotel. I think was the Marriott Hotel. And they both start praying. And John McLaughlin prays the Pater Noster, prays the Our Father. And Jimeno prays just his own extemporaneous prayer. But they start praying together aloud, and they're screaming and they're crying their prayers out. I thought that was powerful. And then as they're pulling McLaughlin out of the rubble, you notice how it forms a kind of grave.
Yeah.
The rectangle, the perfect rectangle that they pull him out of is a kind of resurrection.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I find interesting is that, as said, I mean, you can make meaning in anything, and what we just did, but there's not a lot there in either United 93 or in World Trade Center. I think they're a little bit better than Pearl Harbor, and then they're a little bit truer to what happened. But at the end of the day, it's simply just what happened, and it tries to do as best as it can put the audience in what happened and make the audience feel something, and it succeeds, I think. But with Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, there's a sense of trying to make, I mean, it's really, what's the boy's name?
Oh, Oscar.
It's Oscar's struggle to make meaning out of what he calls the worst day, very appropriately, what he calls the worst day. It's his inability to let go of it until he finds closure, until he finds a way to make sense of it.
And ultimately the question is, how do you make meaning out of something for which it seems like there is no meaning? To me feels like a very Job kind of question. I'm a huge fan of the book of Job because it deals with that. It deals with how do we look for God? How do we engage in tragedy without trying to fall onto our normal easy bumper sticker theology?
There's a few things that struck me about Oscar's journey. First was that he was seeking after a goal, symbolism of a key that opens a lock. It's very powerful. He doesn't find out what the key opens. He never finds it. He finds out that it belonged to someone else and he gives it away. Spoilers. But along the way, he doesn't find meaning by finding out what his father's really someone else's key unlocked. Rather, he finds meaning along the way in who he encounters.
Yes.
In the personal relationships, and that's where he finds healing. The second thing I found interesting was his grandfather's character, Max von Sydow's character, the renter, or his grandfather. We find out he's probably his grandfather. And there's a scene in which the most powerful scene in the film for me was when he was playing his grandfather the messages that his dad left.
Yes.
And his grandfather turns away and his grandfather can't speak, so he keeps writing, please stop, please stop, please stop. And he eventually leaves. And he says, I have to go because I'm hurting you. And I wanted to tell the grandfather, you're not hurting him, you're helping him.
Yeah.
This is, you have no idea how healing this is, that he can have someone to say this to. He's had no one to say this to. And I found that in the grandfather's character is particularly interesting because, of course, he ran away from his responsibilities as a father and as a grandfather later. But I wonder if a lot of times we run away from our responsibilities because we don't see what we're doing right. All we see is the pain that happens around us. We think we're so narcissistic that we think that we're causing the pain, and so we run away, when in reality there's so much in the midst of this pain that we're doing well. Like, I just wanted to tell the grandfather, as a chaplain, you're doing well. You're doing well done. Yeah. I mean, you're getting this child to open up to you. Well done.
Yes. He's accompanying him. He's pushing him to think about things, mm-hmm. In some of the questions that he asks. I think what I saw in that scene is I think he was struggling with his own grief mm-hmm. in that moment.
Well, the fact that he wasn't there for his own son.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to have a relationship with his grandson. I think that was a lot more ideal. But I think what he failed to realize was that the only way that his grandson was going to find closure was by encountering pain. And mm-hmm. he didn't want to be there with his grandson in pain. He wanted to be there with his grandson as a grandfather. Well, of course, that's what a grandfather's supposed to do, I think. But as he wanted to push his grandson on the swing, right, and do the fun granddad things that he never got to do with his son. And so when he was really there for the moment where he was truly being a grandfather to his son, he didn't recognize it. He only saw it as he was hurting his grandson, when in reality he was probably doing the very best thing that he could have done.
What do you think about the revelation at the end that his mom makes, that she's already been a step ahead of him, kind of checking in with everywhere he's going to go? And it's kind of I've already been there. I got your back. I'm watching over you.
That was a neat bit of parenting on the part of her character, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's what ultimately helped them come back together, is that he realized that she was there for him. And then they have this time where they're bonding over, hey, did you meet this person? What did you think about them? And so it was an opportunity for them to relive those things and to connect, because up to that point he had really struggled. He had always seen his dad as the one that he could connect with, and kind of felt like she didn't know necessarily how.
Yeah, and his mother, I think, as I said, it was a neat bit of parenting. I mean, when I'm with Scarlett, I just want to take control, right? And so I could not let Scarlett do what she let her probably autistic child do. Mm-hmm. And yet there's a beautiful dialectic between, on the one hand, engaging with her son by really meeting him where he is in his own paradigm, his own world, even figuring out the complicated mathematical system that he constructed to engage in his project. And on the other hand, letting him go, letting him do it, not stopping him, not wanting to protect him from it, but letting him go and find his way. I mean, that I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was amazing. In fact, I think the mother is probably my favorite character of them all. So
yeah, I kind of think I would agree.
And Sandra Bullock did a good job.
Yeah, I mean, because she's grieving too. She's grieving both her husband, and now she feels like her son is getting further away at first, until she figures out what's going on, and so she finds a way to kind of be there. And I'm kind of, for me, I saw a bit of a parallel in, do you suppose God kind of does that a little bit too?
Yeah.
Kind of watches our footsteps, watches. I mean, I don't have to suppose. I kind of, that's how I imagine God and the Holy Spirit working. Jesus says, I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you will be.
there's a passage in the Bible. It's Proverbs. What's a verse? Proverbs 69. Human being's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs the steps.
It's beautiful.
Mhm. No, and I think that I will say about Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close that it wasn't so much about September 11th per se, because it could have been about any tragedy in which a
Right.
person had lost a loved one. But I do think that its intersection with September 11th makes it the best of the three films. Now, I'm not a film critic, and the purpose of this podcast is not to engage in film criticism, but to pull out stories and to analyze stories and to think about stories from a theological perspective. But to me, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, it takes the viewer a step further than what United 93 and World Trade Center do, in that it's not just about making you feel a certain way. It's helping us to reflect on it, inviting us to decide how or if to make meaning about it, to find closure in it. And it's interesting that that film of the three was the worst in terms of how well it did with the critics. That film was not well liked. Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close was not well liked by the critics, and it did not do well at the box office, I think. I wonder if that was a message that we as a country weren't ready to hear.
I think you're onto something with that. I think we have a really hard time dealing with emotions about things, and I worry about that. We're still in this pandemic, and we're gonna have a lot of cultural trauma, and it's not even just dealing with one moment. We've been dealing with this for 18 months now.
We live by the sword, and we have and will continue to die by the sword.
Yeah.
We live by the gun. We have and will continue to die by the gun. We live by the cruise missile, and we have and will continue to die by the cruise missile. I think it comes to this. Of the three films, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close offers us a way to see September 11th and any tragedy really, but September 11th in particular, in a way that isn't just about politics, that isn't just about triumphing over evil in our righteous mind. It's about an interpersonal experience and about an existential experience about September 11th. And I think part of the problem is, and I think fall of Kabul and the 20th anniversary and all of this is so raw. Is part of the problem is that we want to see it as an attack, as an act of war that we could respond to with righteous violence.
Mm-hmm.
And
World Trade Center kind of alludes to that, when somebody's got to avenge this.
The Marine.
Yeah, and had I watched this right after September 11th, I would have probably gone, yeah, go. And now I'm like, vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
What's so interesting, and I want to mention something about World Trade Center while we're at it, because I feel we should mention it. What's so interesting about the two Marines, something that we really should discuss. These are historical figures. There really was a Staff Sergeant Carnes, and there really was at the time he processed out of the Marines, he was Master Sergeant Jason Thomas, who really did go into the World Trade Center and really were responsible for the rescue of McLaughlin and Jimeno. These are historical characters. All right. Jason Thomas, the other Marine, not the one that the story follows, but the one that joins him as he's entering the site, he was black. The historical one was black. The Master Sergeant Thomas was an African American, and yet in the movie he was white. What struck me about the Marines is that in the film is that I have not to gloss over that, but it's like, especially as we've come to discover lately, in the past 5 years even, that we don't live in a post-racial society. Race matters, unfortunately. Or fortunately,
you're right.
It's important that we whitewashed the heroism of these two Marines. The other thing was the historical Sergeant Carnes, is a Christian supremacist who believes that his purchase of a really expensive car was a God thing because it was part of what enabled him to get to the trade center without question, because he drove really fast to get there. What you saw was what you got in that movie, how the movie depicted him, saying someone has to avenge this. That's who he was. Right? He's Christian supremacist, a right-wing nutbag. That's who he is. In fact, even one of the firefighters calls him, "All right, duck bag," in the film. On the other hand, what gets me choked up is that I see the Marines as agents of imperialism, but I also see them as helpers, fanatically so. The sense of they find when they find Yemeno and he says, "We're not leaving you, buddy. We're Marines. You are our mission." I get choked up when I hear that.
Yeah, that was powerful.
Yeah. And he says, and can you imagine laying down on the rubble? You don't know what happens. For all you know, this is still an accident. Oh my God, they're the Marines. What are the Marines doing here? It sort of reinforces, oh, this is an act of war.
Yeah, I think it's important that I'm glad that you raised that, because I think that we can do better.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and if I remember, I was trying to remember when World Trade Center was made. Was that 2005, give or take?
2006.
It was close.
No, because it was the beginning of my junior year of college. So
yeah, and I was just getting into college that year. So, I think that's the other interesting thing, is watching kind of the progression of like when each of these movies was made and kind of how it talks about events and how it portrays things.
There's a very real sense in which if I was in the rubble, if I had heard United States Marines, if you can hear me yell or tap, that would make me feel very good. Mm-hmm. Like, because it's like, or if I had heard, fire department, if you can hear me yell or tap, hear those people there, that would have made me feel, I think, very, very comforting. So
yeah, absolutely. Do we want to ask how we would address this, or maybe we can talk about, so maybe I'll start by saying this. One of the things that I remember after 9/11 was going to church the next Sunday and the place being quite a bit fuller than usual. And then I remember they trooped in all of the flags and I think I'm trying to remember if we sang a patriotic song. I'm fairly sure we did. And then there was a note that was kind of a pastoral note that was sent home. I remember it talked about misguided and misled young men who attacked, which I forget all of the language now, but it seemed to me fairly even-handed. Mm-hmm. In how it talked about things. But I think about that, like the flags and that kind of thing, and I'm like, I don't know if I could let flags be in my sanctuary, or God, not my sanctuary, but the sanctuary.
You and I have a slight disagreement on that, don't we?
There are flags in the sanctuaries where I serve, and I have never gotten into the let's get rid of them. I have sometimes said maybe let's move them to places of less prominence, because I'm very much the focus in worship and in the sanctuary is on God. Mm-hmm. And I think it muddles the message when you've got symbols of the state there, similarly to the way that having symbols of religion in offices of the state gets muddled.
It's interesting. If I was, first off, I actually do not in principle object to having the American flag in worship. I would put it in the back. Well, yeah, it's not because I don't want it prominent. It's because if you're facing it, then you're worshiping it. Mm-hmm. The idea of worship is you face what you worship. And that's actually why I prefer the priest facing away from the congregation. Of course, in my church, the priest faces the congregation. But I actually disagree. I actually think that having the priest face the congregation, which is what Vatican II do, that's one of the parts of Vatican II, which for everything else I love about it, I don't agree with, because the priest faces away from the congregation towards the altar, then the priest worships with the people. If the priest faces the people, then the priest becomes a kind of object of veneration. Now, if you put the American flag up on the altar, it becomes a kind of object of veneration. But if you put it behind the congregation, then it becomes part of what the congregation offers to God. And to me, our nationality cannot be avoided. We are citizens of the United States, for better and worse. And there is a ceremonial and cultural aspect of that, for better or worse, that we can deny all we want, but it's there. And honestly, whether you like it or not, the best thing to do, in my humble opinion, is to offer it to God and let it.
And I don't disagree with you there. I think, like I said, I would definitely no flags on the altar itself. Mm-hmm. And there was even one time where some very patriotic flower arrangements were on the altar, and I even kind of said, let's maybe move this off towards the side, and they were okay with that. And I agree with you. I think that we have to own our history as Americans, and that we can't, there is that element of what belongs to Caesar. We render to that. And so to some extent, we are citizens of the United States with all of the complex history that brings.
It's not all bad.
Well, and it's interesting. I had a reflection on that element. I'm taking us off into a million directions here. When I traveled to Israel just before the pandemic to visit some of the sites in the Holy Land, when I got my passport, that was kind of I won't say awe-inspiring, but it was a moment that caused pause, because I was holding that and I'm like, this has power to some extent. It comes with office and the power of the Secretary of State, and there's a sense in which I can pretty much guarantee that helps get you through security a little bit more smoothly, going through customs and those kinds of things. Part of that was we were in a group too, but still, for me, there was something about, I would consider myself a patriot. I am grateful for the country that I'm in, and I think it can do great things. And so in that regard, it kind of reminded me of that.
There's a Civil War historian by the name of Barbara Fields who once spoke about the Civil War in the following way. She said, mea culpa, I think we need to remember most of all that the Civil War is not over until we today have done our part in fighting it, as well as in understanding what happened. I want to stress this historian is an African American and a descendant of slaves. She says, until we today have done our part in fighting it, as well as understanding what happened when the Civil War generation fought it. William Faulkner once said that history is not was, it's is. And what we need to remember about the Civil War is that the Civil War is in the present as well as in the past. The generation that fought the war, the generation that argued over the definition of the war, the generation that had to pay the price in blood, that had to pay the price in blasted hopes and lost future, also established a standard that will not mean anything until we finish the work. You can say there's no such thing as slavery anymore. We're all citizens. But if we're all citizens, then we have a task to do to make sure that that too is not a joke. If some citizens live in houses while others live on the streets, then the Civil War is still going on. It's still to be fought. And regrettably, it can still be lost. And to me, I would say the same thing about the revolution, that the Revolutionary War established this country with two tracks. One, a settler colonial track that I think was represented in part by the Confederacy, and another, and by the Union as well, until later in the war, when I think the moral purpose of the war, the Civil War, became clearer in the North. And then two, the tract of democratic republicanism. To me, the revolution is about killing the one track and embracing the other. It's about killing imperialism and settler colonialism. It's about recognizing where we still practice it in our imperial wars, like in Iraq, and in ceasing those practices. It's about recognizing how capitalism corrupts the ideals of the American Revolution, and about embracing the fact that the revolution to create a just and free society, a democratic republic where all persons have the live a life of dignity and respect, is not over, and it can still be lost. And to me, what patriotism means is that I am a citizen and a revolutionary, and my politics, which I'll go ahead and say are very left wing, to me, that is my understanding of patriotism.
So again, I'm going to throw something out here. So how ironic is that the act that was thrown out after, or that was passed after 9/11 was called
Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act, and yet it was probably one of the least
very restrictive.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and it's still going, by the way. They've still renewed parts of it.
parts of it have to do with intelligence services communicating with each other, the sausage making, making war.
Which is, I get that. But then some of the rights that it puts limits on, and then we can argue about Gitmo and those things.
I don't believe that the United States of America is or ever was the greatest country in the world. I don't think there is such a thing as a greatest country in the world. That's bullshit.
Say it ain't so, Andrew.
No, it's bullshit. The idea that
I'm with you.
The idea that I should be more proud of this country than a Russian should be of his country. That's crap. That's ethnocentrism. I don't want a great country. I want a good country. I want a government that takes care of people. I want a society that loves and cherishes creation and other human beings. That's what I want. I want to live in a free and just society. That's all I want. And call it the United States, call it the Soviet Union, call it whatever you want. That's what I would want. And the fact that I was born in the United States, the fact that I've come of age in a culture that is shaped by living in the United States, I mean, I can't cast that off. It's who I am. It's my community. I want to help my community be the best it can be. That's what patriotism means to me. It doesn't mean that I always agree with our political project. It doesn't mean that I always wave the flag. It means that I'm a member of a community. I derive myself from being a member of a community, and I seek to help make that community better.
So one last thing that I was thinking about, I promise. You sparked this when you talked about being shaped, and one reflection that I had as we talked about the pulling out of Afghanistan. And, I realized we've been at war there longer than we were not growing up for me. We've been at war more in my life than we have not been. That got me to thinking about how that has shaped my generation, our generation. I think about the trillions of dollars that we've spent on warfare. I think about the many, many, many lives that we have lost. Kind of saddens me. It's like, what would life have been like had it not been shaped like this? And then I think about, and that's me not even living in the war zone. So to think about the refugees who have lived every day with the possibility that they either may not wake up, or they may wake up and their house is destroyed around them, or their neighbor's house, or they deal with these forces that come in and treat them like objects.
My father used to tell me that when he was growing up, he grew up in a community full of World War II veterans. He was born 10 years after World War II was over, right? And so he grew up with that mythology of, we saved the world, right? We saved the world from fascism. We saved the world from imperialism. We did something truly righteous and great in World War II. And it's not really, but that was the mythology that he grew up with. And there was a sense in which to be an American meant something special. And the United States of America was the great power of, and the last best hope of humanity. All right. And it's funny, my reflection on watching the fall of Kabul was that there could be no more pretense to that. And I felt a kind of grief, because although I didn't believe that, I don't believe in American exceptionalism. I haven't since I was a kid, and I don't believe in American liberal ideology. I many things about this country's ideology I just do not believe in, that I reject. And I certainly don't believe in redemptive violence, which this country is just so central to this country's ideology. And yet I felt a sense of grief that even the pretense of greatness was gone. That sense that what we've grown up with since World War II, that we could go out and conquer the world and do great things and promote liberty and freedom, whatever those mean, it was gone. And I finally felt a sense of grief. And I guess, although I don't believe in these myths, part of me desperately wants to.
Clinging onto the fig leaves there, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So if you were preaching on these movies and on September 11th more generally, what would the takeaway be for the congregation?
I think I would talk about what it means to love our neighbor, maybe even the story of the Good Samaritan. And how, I like Amy Jill Levine's perspective on this. She would basically say to replace the Good Samaritan with the Good Muslim.
Yes.
I think I would talk about that. I would talk about, that can be hard when it feels like we are facing this tragedy. I think I could talk about how do we make meaning out of something that doesn't feel like there's meaning necessarily to be made other than this sucks and God is with us in the suck. I think that's where I would probably go with it.
I guess I would go into redemptive violence. The lesson of September 11th to me is that redemptive violence is bullshit. And it's a very Christian lesson, learned with a tremendous amount of pain and cost, but it's a very Christian lesson. Because to me, that's the theology of the cross right there. Yeah. There can be redemption found in taking violence upon oneself to divert it away from another person, I suppose. But the idea that we would use violence, that Jesus would command legions of angels to conquer the Roman Empire, that's bullshit. It's not the way God works.
So, listener, we would really invite your reactions on this one. This is we've gotten into some deep stuff, and if that has brought up things for you, we welcome that conversation. We want to engage with you on these topics, and so if this is a place for you where it's helpful to share your story of September 11th, if it's helpful for you to think about what it has meant for you even today, or if you've seen these movies, we will not tolerate any language of hate. We're just going to say that.
If you wish to say something Islamophobic, don't. There is no room for Islamophobia or any kind of religious phobia like that on New Faith New Media. Not at all.
But we invite conversation. Those are our boundaries.
Yes, we kind of went a lot of different ways here on this one, Michelle. I'm sorry.
It's okay. There's a lot to talk about.
You want to give the outro?
We can. So thank you, listeners, for joining us for this special conversation of a pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater as we reflect on movies that address September 11th in film. If you have liked the conversation, or let me put it this way, if you have found meaning in the conversation, we invite you to continue joining with us through our Facebook discussion page, through our Patreon account, where you can give at the $2, $5, or $10 level and can listen in on our Blessed Lunatics show and get other behind the scenes content. We need your support to continue doing this work, and we think that it's an important work. And so if you are willing to help us by sharing our episodes, by engaging with us in the conversation, we really value your support and we thank you for it. And we ask that you join not just this show, but a lot of our other shows that are coming up. We have Faith in What Resonates with Gail Gallagher. We have Faith in the Dice with James Perrin and Wesley Morrison Sloat. We have Breaking Fast with Saint Sparkle Bear, who and we're really excited for these shows that we are having a lot of different ways to engage with what it means to live a life of faith and to find meaning in life. And so we invite you to connect with us in all of these different ways and support us and let us know what we can do that will help you to continue in that journey in your life. We are thankful that you have joined us today, and we hope that you will join us again next time on our regularly scheduled times.